Les ennemis du peuple!
Burkina Faso didn't calm down after the coup failed. It exploded. Across every city, protests swept through the streets like wildfire, fueled by something bigger than anger. But did these protesters know something that we don't? Let's find out. What happened in Burkina Faso after the coup failed cannot be reduced to mere headlines. The streets didn't return to silence. They didn't sigh in relief. They detonated. The people rose across Ouagadougou, Bobo-Dioulasso, Koudougou, and countless towns and villages, not in panic, but in perfect clarity. This was not a reaction to instability. It was a rejection of submission. The protests weren't a side story. They were the real story. The coup may have been crushed behind palace walls, but a revolution had just begun in the streets. Crowds poured into the avenues without waiting for permission. There were no calls from party leaders or televised rallying cries. It happened as if on instinct. Entire families marched together, not out of fear, but out of fury. They didn't come with demands. They came with warnings. Placards and spray-painted walls declared their message. Burkina is not for sale. No to France. Traitors will fall. These weren't the signs of people begging for protection. They were the warnings of people ready to defend their soil. The mood was serious, almost sacred. There was no festival air, no performative optimism. Protesters walked in tight lines, stood in deliberate silence, and sometimes sang old revolutionary songs from the era of Thomas Sankara. Elders joined the youth. Market women walked alongside former soldiers. School children held homemade flags. Each group knew its role. Some organized security, others distributed water, but all moved with the same mission: to show the world that this time, the people were awake, and they would not be lulled back into sleep. Their slogans made it clear. This wasn't about restoring calm. It was about drawing a line that would not be crossed again. The people weren't only reacting to the coup, they were calling out the invisible forces behind it. Their eyes weren't just on the men who plotted in shadows, but on the embassies and organizations that fund silence, push reforms wrapped in chains, and speak the language of peace while practicing sabotage. Protesters pointed fingers at France, the old colonizer whose shadow still lingers, and at ECOWAS, whose recent history of defending neoliberal elites had made it a symbol of betrayal. But beneath the fury was something even more powerful: a deep, righteous certainty. The people knew exactly what they were fighting for. They weren't simply supporting Traoré. They were defending the very idea of national self-determination. For many, the failed coup was not the story. It was just the trigger. The real story was the generational rebellion now taking shape on the streets. A rebellion not of bullets and barricades, but of identity and purpose. Young Burkinabés who had grown up hearing about Sankara but never seeing his vision come alive were now carrying his torch forward, without waiting for approval. This new generation was not naive. They had seen what happened to leaders who resisted Western control. They had read the history books that erased Africa's heroes and glorified its colonizers. They knew how coups were manufactured, how IMF debt disguised itself as help, how NGOs became fronts for foreign agendas. And still, they came out, not because they expected victory, but because they refused to surrender. There was also an unmistakable visual language that formed organically. People painted red lines across their faces to symbolize blood already shed for freedom. Children held signs that read, "I won't be a slave," while young men carried stones as symbolic weapons, not to throw, but to say they would not run. National flags were everywhere, but they weren't clean official ones. They were dirty, stitched, handwritten, soaked in sweat and dust, like the people themselves. These weren't props, they were shields of defiance. And perhaps the most haunting part of these protests was their calm. These weren't mobs. There were no leaders with megaphones, no politicians hijacking the stage. Instead, the protests looked like a moving ritual, a public prayer for liberation wrapped in thunder. It was as if the land itself was speaking through the people, reminding the world that Burkina Faso wasn't just a nation. It was a memory of freedom still breathing under siege. To the West, this looked like a warning. To the people, it felt like an awakening. These weren't demonstrations to be pacified. They were declarations. And what they declared was simple: we are not scared, we are not small, and we are not going back. They weren't just marching in the streets. They were rewriting who owns the streets. But the street was only the first battlefield. Something far more strategic, far more encrypted, was already taking shape beyond the banners and chants. If the protests were the fire, then online, underground, and unspoken, the people were building a second front. If the protests were the body of the resistance, then its brain was online. And it didn't speak in chants or banners, it spoke in encryption, memes, maps, and coded messages that moved faster than any government could trace. The revolution wasn't just happening in the streets of Burkina Faso, it was being engineered in real time through digital backchannels, curated by a new class of activists who had never stepped into a political office but understood power like generals. At the heart of this uprising was a generation of Burkinabe youth fluent in both history and algorithms. These weren't rebels in the bush camps. These were cyber revolutionaries, raised on Sankara speeches, YouTube tutorials, and Twitter warfare. Their battlefield wasn't just the avenue, it was the comment section, the group chat, the live stream. And their weapons weren't guns, they were symbols, videos, voice notes, and viral disruption. Coordination was surgical. Entire protest movements were quietly choreographed using encrypted messaging apps like Signal and Telegram. These weren't just for logistics, they were command centers. One group would map police checkpoints, another would monitor the movement patterns of suspected agitators. Digital scouts would track convoy routes and alert crowds in real time. There were even aerial drone videos posted online, not by journalists, but by protest-aligned techies who hacked low-cost drones to film overhead and track security deployments. And then there were the symbolic codes. They weren't loud. They were designed to blend in and infiltrate. Protesters started using small colored threads tied around their wrists or ankles. Green for local protector zones, yellow for medics, red for legal observers. At first glance, they looked like fashion. But to those in the know, they were markers of trust, responsibility, and duty. Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. In Ouagadougou, a seemingly random chalk mark on a wall, a triangle with 3 dots, became a sign of safe house or recharge zone for protest leaders who needed shelter, phone charging, or food. No one announced it. It just spread. Some protesters even communicated in modified sign language, developed weeks earlier in youth political circles, and passed through music collectives, football groups, and student associations. But nothing revealed the depth of strategy like the way protesters handled information warfare. A small group known online made it their mission to deconstruct media lies in real time. Whenever international outlets framed the protests as chaotic or pro-junta, they released counter-narratives within minutes, complete with raw footage, timestamps, and public debunkings of foreign journalists' tweets. They didn't wait for approval, they didn't ask to speak, they took the mic. Their posts weren't just rebuttals, they were digital strikes. They turned propaganda into a game of whack-a-mole, where the mole got crushed before it even surfaced. And what made it more dangerous to foreign influence was that these kids weren't just angry, they were correct. They had receipts, and they knew how to use them. Beyond information, correction came information warfare. Some users created memes that mocked Western hypocrisy, juxtaposing Macron's speeches on African democracy with images of French mercenaries in Mali. Others dug up past statements by NGOs and diplomatic staff, cross-referencing them with leaked documents and donor funding trails. The internet in Burkina Faso had become a court of revolution, where even tweets could become evidence. And when the government called for vigilance against coup plotters, the online army took it further. Lists began to circulate. Not government lists, but people's lists. Not names, but symbols. Organizations, vehicles, phone numbers known to be involved in suspicious movement. None of it was provable in court. But in the streets, they became gospel. Citizens formed watch groups. Online maps were marked with red zones, yellow corridors, and green holdouts. Some even adapted gaming apps to simulate response strategies in case of another coup wave. But the most profound transformation wasn't technological, it was psychological. In this encrypted universe, fear broke down. People no longer felt alone, isolated, or outmatched. Every phone became a tool of resistance. Every group chat became a fortress. And every youth, whether a DJ, a med student, or an unemployed coder, became a part of a living, breathing resistance web that spanned cities, villages, and even the diaspora. That's what made the protests untouchable. You could block a road, but not a signal. You could arrest a chant leader, but not a Twitter thread. You could shut down a square, but the revolution had already gone underground, into servers, into code, into minds. This wasn't accidental. It was a strategy born from trauma. After years of being watched, betrayed, and manipulated by powers who spoke of stability while undermining it, the people had stopped trusting institutions, so they built their own, not in buildings, but in bandwidth. And this shift, from physical resistance to symbolic and digital mastery, was perhaps the most terrifying to those watching from abroad. Because you can sanction a government, you can destabilize an army. But how do you crush an idea that travels at the speed of light? The protests in Burkina Faso weren't just visible, they were viral. Not because of technology, but because of the people who decided to control the narrative of their existence. But even as the digital movement expanded, another layer emerged, one that whispered rather than shouted. Not just the voice of the people, but the names no one dared to say out loud. They called it La Liste Noire, the blacklist. No one knew who created it. No one had seen it printed. But everyone claimed to have heard about someone who was on it. Not ordinary criminals or bandits. These were names with weight: journalists, NGO workers, activists, lawyers, even a few government insiders. Names that once held influence now floating in the air like warnings. The list, it was said, was not maintained by the state, at least not officially. It was something murkier. A collaboration between military loyalists, civilian informants, and youth vigilantes who had taken it upon themselves to defend the revolution from within. To them, the coup plot wasn't just an event, it was a symptom. And if it happened once, it could happen again. Not unless the virus was found and purged. And so began the hunt for traitors. Not through courts, not through press conferences, through whispers, absences, and surveillance. The first signs were subtle. A popular blogger who had criticized the protests suddenly deleted all his posts and vanished from social media. A university professor known for liberal ideas missed 2 lectures, then resigned without explanation. A community organizer who worked with a foreign-funded development agency reportedly fled to Togo after pressure from unnamed youth groups. No one admitted to anything. But the silences were loud. Unlike the protests which demanded global attention, the blacklist operated in shadows. And that made it terrifying. Because in a nation already tense from decades of coups and manipulation, silence felt like a scream. When someone disappeared, the first question wasn't, where did they go? It was, who reported them? The pressure to choose a side grew unbearable for many. In neighborhoods where the protests were strongest, neutrality became treason. If you didn't attend a march, if you didn't repost nationalist content, if you stayed quiet, you became suspicious by default. Some say the list didn't even need names, just patterns of behavior. A silent face in a photo, a deleted tweet. And while many feared the blacklist, others celebrated it. To them, it was justice overdue. Burkina Faso had been violated for too long. Its sovereignty toyed with by elites who wore African names but carried foreign loyalties. As one protester put it, we don't need trials. The West never gave us trials. They gave us assassinations. We're just finally speaking their language. It was this atmosphere, part paranoia, part purification, that made the moment so volatile. A nation fighting to cleanse itself without knowing how deep the poison ran. And here, something even more dangerous crept in: community enforcement. Youth groups that once organized marches have now began organizing patrols, not to fight insurgents, but to observe their neighborhoods. They checked who was attending political gatherings. They tracked unusual vehicles. Some began publicly confronting individuals accused of being agents of France or ECOWAS. Nothing violent yet, but deeply invasive. Reputation, once a matter of social pride, had become a matter of physical safety. In some cases, it went further. A leaked voice note circulated in a local Telegram group, allegedly featuring a vigilante leader boasting about detaining a former army officer in a re-education compound. The recording, if real, confirmed a long-feared truth. Parallel justice systems were emerging, run not by law, but by loyalty. The military leadership, for its part, remained strategically quiet. They neither confirmed nor denied the existence of the list. When asked, they spoke only of the need for vigilance and national hygiene. It was a careful balance. Acknowledge too much, and you validate fear. Deny too much, and you lose the trust of your defenders. But the people didn't need confirmation. They had already made up their minds. For many, the blacklist wasn't a threat. It was a tool of survival, a way to ensure that the revolution didn't eat itself like all the others, a way to keep the cancer of compromise from returning. If names had to be erased for the dream to live, so be it. Yet not all agreed. Exiled journalists, opposition figures abroad, and some within Burkina's diaspora began to speak out. They warned that the revolution, while righteous, was now walking a thin line between justice and authoritarianism, that in hunting ghosts, it might create new monsters, that in purging enemies, it might lose friends. But those voices were distant. To the people on the ground, surrounded by the smell of smoke and the rhythm of war drums, the choice was clear. Better to lose a few now than lose the nation forever. The list may or may not exist on paper, but it exists in minds, in glances, in the way people lower their voices at dusk. And in a country that has been betrayed too many times, sometimes the fear of betrayal is enough to justify preemptive punishment. Because while some are focused on enemies within, others are watching forces far bigger and more powerful, gathering just outside the gate. From Paris to Washington, Abuja to Brussels, the reaction was eerily consistent. Silence. Not the silence of disinterest, but of calculation. Burkina Faso's protests didn't fit the usual script. These weren't desperate cries for foreign intervention. They were public declarations of independence, broadcast in real time and backed not by elite spokespeople, but by barefoot crowds and encrypted youth networks. And that terrified the people who once believed Africa could be managed. In diplomatic cables and intelligence reports, the tone shifted quickly. Burkina Faso was no longer just a fragile Sahelian state battling coups and insurgents. It was suddenly something much more dangerous, an idea, a precedent, a proof of concept that an African nation, led by a young military leader, could ignite mass civic support not by mimicking Western models, but by rejecting them completely. The panic wasn't over instability, it was over inspiration. Because what happens in Ouagadougou doesn't stay in Ouagadougou. Within days of the protests, embassies in Mali, Niger, Togo, and even Senegal began filing quiet updates. Youth movements across the region were watching. Group chats lit up with clips of Burkinabe crowds chanting "Souveraineté ou rien," sovereignty or nothing. Anonymous pages popped up sharing protest strategies, live-stream tactics, and guides to organizing neighborhood patrols. The Burkina model was spreading, and it was spreading fast. That's what made the foreign policy community nervous. Because this wasn't just about one country pulling away, it was about a continent remembering. Remembering that the Berlin Conference was never consented to. The CFA franc was never voted on. That development had always meant dependency, and security had always arrived in foreign uniforms. In private, French officials reportedly described Burkina Faso as a rupture point. Not because of any military breakthrough, but because of the optics. A former colony that no longer cares if it gets punished. Captain Traoré's defiance wasn't diplomatic theater. It was the posture of a man who had calculated the cost of rebellion and accepted it with both hands. That kind of leadership, especially when backed by the streets, is radioactive. France, in particular, found itself in an impossible position. Push too hard, and it confirms the protesters' narrative of neo-colonial interference. Back off, and it allows the movement to metastasize regionally. French media scrambled to reframe the protests as anti-democratic or populist, quietly linking them to Russian influence or regional destabilization. But the footage didn't lie. There were no foreign flags in the protests, just Burkinabe ones, often hand-painted, flying on sticks. And while Europe watched nervously, the United States played its usual waiting game, one foot in diplomacy, the other in plausible deniability. Official statements called for dialogue and calm, but within defense circles, there were growing concerns about losing the Sahel as a controllable corridor. Burkina Faso is more than a landlocked country. It's a geopolitical wedge between North and West Africa, rich in gold and increasingly rich in defiance. ECOWAS, meanwhile, found itself on the edge of irrelevance. Once touted as a stabilizing force, it had become a symbol of elite preservation, a club of presidents more concerned with their longevity than their people's sovereignty. The protests in Burkina Faso made ECOWAS look toothless, outdated, and deeply out of touch. Every youth chant of "Down with ECOWAS" was a nail in the coffin of a regional order built on borrowed ideals and fragile consensus. But what terrified policymakers most wasn't just the noise, it was the discipline. Burkinabe protesters didn't loot, didn't riot, didn't burn down their neighborhoods. They organized water stations. They coordinated medical assistance. They documented everything. It looked less like an uprising and more like a prelude to state building. And that's what rattled the foreign observers. This wasn't collapse. It was conscious reinvention. Even more worrying was the ideological clarity. This wasn't vague anti-government rage. It was philosophical resistance, with Sankarah's legacy at the center and Pan-African autonomy as its spine. This wasn't about reforming colonial structures. It was about erasing them and writing new blueprints from scratch. But will the West try to downplay this? Can they even do it? Let us know in the comment section. Is Africa awake now? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.